Well, Keith Murdoch, who really doesn't like his first name, retired today. Or did he? The 92-year-old Rupert Murdoch, who has spewed more lies into the news atmosphere than anyone in history, sent an email to his employees today saying, "I am writing to let you all know that I have decided to transition to the role of Chairman Emeritus at Fox and News." He also said, "I will be watching our broadcasts with a critical eye, reading our newspapers and websites and books with much interest, and reaching out to you with thoughts, ideas, and advice." The email said that his son, Lachlan, will become sole chairman of both companies. So the son, who would never be employed in such a capacity anywhere other than his father's company, is in charge now, but Daddy will be watching. Our first guest tonight, Michael Wolff, will decode that for us, as he does in his perfectly timed new book titled, as I just said, The Fall, The End of Fox News and the Murdoch Dynasty. The book contains the first inside account of exactly how and why Tucker Carlson was fired, including exactly what was said to him on the phone in his last discussion with his employer, which came, according to the book, as a complete shock to Tucker Carlson, who thought that phone call was going to be about something else. It was Michael Wolff who first took us inside the Trump White House with the very first book reported from literally inside the Trump White House. That book was by Michael Wolff, titled Fire and Fury. Michael Wolff was not a favorite of the Washington news media and the establishment press when he beat everyone in the race to deliver the first inside account of the workings of the Trump White House. His methodology was criticized by many in the news media, and you can be sure they will criticize Michael Wolff's reporting in his new book because it has several untraceable sources, which is actually common in the books written by reporters who will criticize this book. Such books could not be written without anonymous sourcing. It was Michael Wolff's anonymous sourcing that told us that Donald Trump's first Secretary of State called Donald Trump an effing moron. That was one of many items that Michael Wolff's doubters found hard to believe when his book was published. It has been repeatedly confirmed since then, including, in effect, by Rex Tillerson, who never once denied it. Michael Wolff's new book quotes Rupert Murdoch saying the same thing about the longest-running host still working at Fox, Sean Hannity, who the book said Rupert Murdoch wanted to fire before he decided to fire Tucker Carlson instead. Michael Wolff's book quotes Rupert Murdoch as saying the same thing about Donald Trump, calling Donald Trump a moron, an idiot, a fool, plainly nuts, an effing crazy man, and a loser. No doubt the loser being the most painful of those words for Donald Trump. Fox is very worried about what Michael Wolff is revealing about the network and about the Murdochs in his new book. But they put out a statement about the book that does not deny a single word in the book. The childish Fox statement simply says, the fact that this author's books are spoofed by Saturday Night Live is really all we need to know. Every publisher would love to have their books on Saturday Night Live in some way. No one in the news business thinks that that's all we need to know. And because Fox has never been in the news business, no one there actually knows how to respond to Michael Wolff's book. The first lie that the network ever told was in its name. Rupert Murdoch decided to call it Fox News. Andy Cohen could have decided to call Bravo, Bravo News, so everyone in the news business would then be forced to pretend that Bravo was in the news business. Fox has never been in the news business, not for one day, but they have always been in, as Michael Wolff points out, the television business. And according to Michael Wolff, who has been studying and reporting on Rupert Murdoch, including in a previous book, for decades, Rupert Murdoch has always been in the pursuit of money and power. His pursuit of money succeeded, but the power he achieved, he was pathetically afraid to use when it mattered most, not just to him, but to the world. Michael Wolff reliably reports that Rupert Murdoch has always thought Donald Trump is a clown and a fool. And like every sane person in the country, Rupert Murdoch thought Donald Trump's presidential campaign was an embarrassment from the start, which became an especially painful embarrassment when Donald Trump criticized Republican Senator John McCain in the first weeks of his campaign for having been a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Donald Trump said he preferred soldiers who didn't get captured. The day after that, Rupert Murdoch tweeted, "When is Donald Trump going to stop embarrassing his friends, let alone the whole country?" Donald Trump was running in the single digits in the polls when Rupert Murdoch tweeted that. Rupert Murdoch had the power then to crush Donald Trump. Rupert Murdoch could have used the power of his Fox propaganda channel to crush Donald Trump, but instead, Donald Trump quickly doubled his numbers in the polls and then doubled them again and suddenly was at 24%, with Rupert Murdoch having no idea what to do about that. And as Donald Trump continued to climb in the polls, Rupert Murdoch simply cowered in fear of Donald Trump's rise and fear of Fox viewers. In that sense, Rupert Murdoch was utterly powerless. He owned the network, but he was owned by the audience. And so he didn't use his power and decided instead to simply cash in on the Trump candidacy and reach new highs in the ratings for Fox. The book tells us that the new boss at Fox, whose father will still be watching his every move, was very disappointed when Donald Trump was elected president, and that his children cried. But the son, being as cowardly as the father in the face of Donald Trump, never attempted to use Fox's power when they could have to crush Donald Trump. The book reports Rupert Murdoch to have been pleased when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in the last presidential election, but then, in continued craven fear of his audience, Rupert Murdoch made the grotesque business decision to continue to feed them Donald Trump's lies about the election being stolen, and Rupert Murdoch's profoundly stupid decision to deliver every Trump lie about the election directly to the Fox audience ended up costing Rupert Murdoch $787.5 million in the largest defamation judgment to ever land in the news business. The lawsuit itself was an extended demonstration of Rupert Murdoch's relentless stupidity as a litigant and an executive. Rupert Murdoch settled the case after the damage was done. Every company in America knows that the danger in lawsuits is in the discovery process, not the trial. The discovery process is where we obtained emails and text messages from people working inside Fox that we otherwise would never have seen. That's where we got the text message from Tucker Carlson where he says that he hates Trump passionately. Rupert Murdoch foolishly submitted to an under oath deposition in which his testimony damaged Fox's defense significantly. Testimony that Murdoch never would have had to give if he was smart enough to settle the case before people at Fox, including Tucker Carlson and Rupert Murdoch, were forced to testify under oath and hand over all their emails and text messages. Only on the morning when the trial was about to begin, when Rupert Murdoch and Tucker Carlson would have been the first witnesses called in the case, only then did the astonishingly reckless elderly executive finally decide that he had to settle the case. And according to Michael Wolff's book, it wasn't just for money.